Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Stina Cowan. I am the Educational and Cultural Programs Manager here at the National Nordic Museum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today to this virtual book talk on Sami media and Indigenous agency in the Arctic North with authors Tom DuBois, Coppélie, Cocq, and which is moderated by Troy Storfjell. We are especially thrilled to host this event today on National Sami Day. We think it's a perfect way to celebrate this important day. After the talk, there will be a chance to ask questions, and we ask that you post those questions in the Q&A function on your screen, and we will get to as many of those as we have time for at the end. If you think of those questions during the talk, feel free to write them as you think of them. The National Nordic Museum acknowledges the impact of colonialism on Indigenous peoples. We celebrate the continuity of Indigenous communities in the Nordic countries and North America through our exhibitions, programs, and collections. And we acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the DuBois people. We are thrilled to have such a wide and large audience with us here today. And at last count, we had representation from 33 of the states here in the United States, 5 Canadian provinces, 9 additional countries from 4 continents. This is a true testament of the relevance and importance of this topic. Thank you all for being here. Before we dive into the program, I want to share a short introduction from Andy Nestigan. Andy is professor and head of the Scandinavian department at the University of Washington. And he is also an editor for this series that the book is a part of. He could not be with us today, unfortunately, but he was gracious enough to record a little introduction, and I'm going to share that with you now.
Good morning. My name is Andy Nestigan, and I'm the series editor of New Directions in Scandinavian Studies at the University of Washington Press. And the University of Washington Press and our series is the publisher of Sami Media and Indigenous Agency in the Arctic North by Coppélie, Cocq, and Tom DuBois. And so I'm excited to introduce this lecture this morning because of that connection, and the University of Washington Press is so proud of this book and the opportunity to reach out to audiences like you who are interested in these topics and see their importance. I think the important part of this book is that it really does a great job of looking at some objects that haven't been looked at as carefully as they need to be in Nordic media studies and media studies in general, and that is Indigenous Indigenous media texts and artifacts. And as this book shows in examining those objects, there's a tremendous amount to be learned, by understanding how Sami citizens, activists, people have used media to create a sort of media sphere that both serves their communities as well as interacts with other communities, both in the Nordic countries, in Europe, and around the world in a kind of a trans-Indigenous media context, we might say. So there's a tremendous amount to be learned from this research, and I think we're in great hands with our authors, Coppélie, Cocq, and Tom DuBois, who have studied the use of media by Sami people so carefully, Sami artists so carefully, and done tremendous things with that. And one of the things I think is important to take away from a book like this is to recognize that in a global media environment in which we often think of the big players as determining everything, Facebook, Twitter, etc., in fact, we can see that smaller communities, for example, the Sami, are using media in really innovative and creative ways to do important political and cultural work for their communities that takes advantage of global interconnection, but does so to push it in different directions than we might think when we think of Facebook and the like. So I just am so excited to introduce this talk this morning and to say thanks to Tom and Coppélie for allowing us to publish their book in the series. And I wish you an exciting and stimulating morning in listening to this lecture and engaging with these authors. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today, Troy Storfjell. Troy, who's Sami, specializes in Sami and Indigenous studies, where his work is largely guided by critical Indigenous approaches and methods. In his scholarship, Troy works to create a place for Indigenous intellectual and philosophical traditions within the academy, bringing Indigenous-centered ways of knowing to topics such as settler colonial literature, multicultural diversity, and trans-Indigenous film studies. Troy is a professor at the Pacific Lutheran University. We are so thrilled to have you here, as well as Tom and Coppélie, and we look forward to this discussion, and everybody enjoy this talk. Thank you.
Kiitos, Tiina. Pueri iidet ja liikku Sami albutpäivin. Mun leen Troy Storfjell, leen Sápmilas, Norga bieles Marko Sápmilas, mutta orun ja barkun pujalop, stella kumjan nisquali alpmukid guovlas. Keit mun mind aikun giitut. Good morning and happy Sami National Day. As you heard, I'm Troy Storfjell, and I am Sami, more specifically Mark Sami from the Norwegian side. But I live and work on the traditional lands of the Puyallup, Stellakum, and Nisqually people, and I would like to thank and acknowledge them here at this moment. I'm so happy that you're all joining us for this event on this special day. Sami Alapmutpäivi, Sami National Day, is celebrated throughout Sápmi with all sorts of festivities and other events. And it commemorates the first Sami National Congress, which was held in 1917 in Troante, or Trondheim, under the leadership of Elsa Laula, who later married and became known as Elsa Laula Reinberg. Sami Alapmutpäivi has been celebrated in Sápmi since 1993, and here in the Puget Sound area since 2013 by institutions like Pacific Lutheran University, where I work, the Pacific Sami Skarvi, and the National Nordic Museum. Today, I'm especially happy and honored to be able to moderate this author's talk by two longtime friends of mine who have written a wonderful book about Sami media entitled Sami Media and Indigenous Agency in the Arctic North, published by the University of Washington Press last year in 2020. Coppélie Cocq is professor of European ethnology at the University of Helsinki, Finland, and professor of Sami studies at Umeå University, Sweden. Her research interests lie in the fields of folkloristics and digital humanities, with specific focus on storytelling, placemaking, and revitalization in Indigenous contexts. Ethical and methodological perspectives on digital research are other topical issues in her research. Among her previous publications are Revoicing Sami Narratives, North Sami Storytelling at the Turn of the 20th Century, and the co-edited volume, Perspectives on Indigenous Writing and Literacies. Welcome, Coppélie. Tom DuBois is the Halls Bascom Professor of Scandinavian Studies, Folklore, and Religious Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is a university I'm proud to have graduated from myself. He is chair of the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic, and affiliate faculty in the American Indian Studies program and Religious Studies program. He holds a doctorate in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania and was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Umeå for his work in helping formulate the university's Sami studies curriculum. Prior to his appointment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison 20 years ago, he taught for 10 years at the University of Washington, Seattle, where he was instrumental in the establishment of both Finnish studies and Baltic studies within the university's Department of Scandinavian Studies. His Sami studies research includes not only the present volume, but also studies of various Sami artists past and present, such as Lars Levi Sunna, who is featured in a chapter of Tom's University of Washington Press book from 2018, Sacred to the Touch. He has also translated the historically important works of Sami author Juhan Turi, including his 1910 Muittelu Saamit Pirra, an account of the Sami, and his later Makta Muittalusat, translated last year as travel accounts, published by Rauda Lagerus. And I would like to add on a personal note, Tom was also my dissertation advisor, so I'm always happy when I can do something with him. So welcome, Tom. My first question for the two of you is, what inspired or motivated you to write this book together? And why do you think the world needs a book about Sami media?
You want me to start, Tom? I'll start. I want to, first off, before trying to answer that question, just thank the National Nordic Museum, Stina, for this invitation, and Troy for your gracious introduction, and Andy, and the folks at the press, Margaret Sullivan and Lauren McLaughlin as the acquisitions editor, were just like fantastic partners in this process. So I feel like it's a book that, for whatever reasons we decided to do it, was a great collective effort. And I also salute all of the Sami artists and intellectuals who were incredibly generous with their time and input on and correcting tremendously graciously different terrible mistakes that we were making at one moment or another in writing the book, as always happens when one is researching. But the book is really the product of a dialogue. And I guess to get to your question, I think that when one looks at Sami culture, the media presence and the way in which creative friend making and image making and sharing of music and art and is an absolutely integral part of the way that Sami people perform Saminess, both for the wider world and for themselves. And we really wanted to acknowledge that and to help give people a guide into some of that material as it has unfolded over 4 centuries, but particularly as it was giving a snapshot up to the year of 2018. So Coppélie, do you have something to add?
Maybe some. I won't add to the list of things and acknowledgement. The list is quite long in the book, as you hear, because there have been a lot of people involved in our work. And I would say that also one reason of our source of inspiration, motivation is, well, since I work qualitatively, so most of my materials are based on interviews and conversations. And when I've been working a couple of years with these issues, mostly on digital media use in Sápmi, I've received a lot of encouragement and support to keep writing about that. So in this interviews and conversation, there was Sami cultural worker and internet users pointing to the fact it's really important to keep highlighting and showing what's happening in Sápmi, what's being done there for the Sami point of view. So that's also that support that has meant quite a lot in that. And I like your question about what the word would need such a book. It's quite ambitious way to put it, but okay, let's be ambitious. But I think also that's this well-established picture that traditional media often fail to represent, to include minority groups. And one thing that's interesting with media is it provides opportunities for more people or other groups to contribute with what's being covered in media in general, and maybe question also established discourse and show alternatives to national media. So I think it's both interesting and important to pay attention to what's going on there on media.
Yeah, follow up with that. There's Kaira Lanselius in this really wonderful anthology called Native on the Net. Really underscores that fact that there was one set of amazing media innovations in radio and television that in many ways tended to exclude Indigenous voices and faces and input because of the expense of that production. And in this later, the internet innovation, it has been much more possible for Indigenous communities to gain access to that technology and to produce their own works. And it makes a completely different world for Indigenous communities wanting to reach a wider community, to tell their story, and also to tell their story to themselves.
That's great. Early on in the book, you elaborate on the differences between the Sami term gullahallan and the English term, or European term, really, communication. Could you explain those differences and why they're important to your analysis?
Yeah, so, well, communication is based on etymology, but also from media communication perspectives, is about to share something and also quite a lot an act of receiving. And this term, like the meaning also evolved from transmitting tangibles to more abstract of transmitting ideas and knowledge and so on. So in our book, we discuss communication in relation to the North Sami term Gola Hallan, where well, the root and the meaning is more about to hear and to understand. So here focus is less on the transmission of materials and more on this process of interaction, reciprocity. Gola Hallan connotes more a sense of negotiating and mutually shared understanding, where people come to understand each other by speaking and hearing and listening to each other. So we make this parallel also with new media and how Sami independent groups are maybe better prepared to the affordances of digital media when we think about this relation to communication more in terms of reciprocity and adaptation. But I think our main point here is that what we're witnessing today is nothing really new when we talk about digital communication, and this seeming novelty of digital media in Sápmi needs also to be understood in the broader context of Sami use of media and Sami communication, and based on the historical, cultural, and social circumstances and contexts.
Oh, that's great. What other ways was your work in this book informed by Sami terminology and intellectual traditions?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at that one and say that one of the things we decided to do very intentionally in the book is use Sami snow terminology in a very substantive way to acknowledge a tremendous amount of important scholarship that Sami scholars have done, much of which is only in Sami, on Sami snow terminology as a reflection of Sami indigenous knowledge of worldview and of creativity. And we felt that in many ways in the Western Academy, there are the metaphors that we use in creating a study are often based on, let's say, Mediterranean or Central European ideas. We talk about the marketplace of ideas, or we talk about, you know, the pulpit. But we really wanted to front Sami notions of and use Sami metaphors in ways that were respectful of Sami culture, and also acknowledge that there's a distinctive Sami way to do media. And connected with that, also, we wanted to front places. And Coppélie's backdrop there is a good example about that. Coppélie, do you want to tell us where that is?
Yeah, so this is what we're seeing now is Jokkmokk, and it's a picture from the Jokkmokk Winter Market a few years ago. And the Jokkmokk Winter Market is one of the main events happening in Sápmi every year. Which is really a gathering, a cultural event, but also a social event of big importance for many Sami. And it's actually happening right now, but digitally this year because of the pandemics. So after this talk, not now, but after this talks, if you're interested, you can just log in and look. That's actually quite an amazing program. It's been going on for a week, and it continues. I think it ends tomorrow. So you still have a chance to do that. But yeah, so the choice of places was also a way for us to show the importance of the land, origin, and ancestors that we see in Sápmi. So it was for us like the way to structure the book, but also to acknowledge its importance, and also to emphasize the heterogeneity, because Sápmi is really a broad area, and we wanted to show the variety of places that are there. And maybe it's a little bit a way to take a reader in a journey through Sápmi and visiting different places like the Jokkmokk Winter Market, or Ubmeje, the Center of Revitalization Process for the Ume Sami language, or Galok, where the protest movement in 2013 sparked also a bigger debate about exploitation in indigenous lands, and other places through the book.
I really like that, and I like the way that you that in dealing with Sami intellectual traditions and terms, you tie it to place, because it is land-based and place-based knowledge, and that's so important. So I think that comes across really well in the book, the way it's structured. One of the things you talk about, of course, is or write about is film, and many of us are familiar with some of the bigger Sami films like Ofelash, or Pathfinder, or the Kautokeino Rebellion, or Sami Blood. But these films, exist in larger contexts that your book helps to explain. How would you say these internationally recognized feature films fit into trends in Sami filmmaking, media, and cultural life?
I can start. I think Tom, you have a lot to say about that too, but Sami Blood, I think, is a really good example of what has happened on the international and Sami scene for films. Because I would say the film is really about Swedish history, actually. It's much more than a Sami film. And I think that part of the success of the film internationally can also be explained by the fact that it's about tensions and personal choices, people having to negotiate between two different cultures. And that's something that many people can relate to. And we know also that misconduct, such as the one depicted in the film or similar, have taken place in many indigenous settings. And it's not part of the national histories that we're being told. So I think that's one of the reasons why this film has been so important. And when we talk about trends in Sami filmmaking, media and cultural life, I think it illustrates also how today it's not about Sami film or making a Sami film, but or a film, or in the same way it's not about being a Sami artist, but an artist. And that a lot of cultural workers are challenging the idea of Sami production as something disparate from national or international scene and based on other criteria or value in different ways or for other reasons.
I would add to that only that, one of the things that is exciting to watch about the production of Sami films over time is how one film success can create the basis for another and another and another, that we see with Ofelash in '89, this sudden innovation of ideas that, wow, one can make a film that is in Sami language and that takes up Sami topics, and the market success of that film, the fact that it attracted worldwide attention, made it possible on an economics plane for subsequent filmmakers, Sami filmmakers, to take up other works as well and to develop their products, so that there's this kind of go team notion to it where the success of different media workers has made it possible for the next. And Sami artists have been quite often tremendously generous with each other in helping people along and encouraging new artists to take things in new directions. And that's just a really inspiring thing to look at, this artistic context that's not competitive, but that is cooperative in a way that is kind of integrally Sami.
What about short films and the Sami, International Sami Film Institute? You discussed that a bit in your work, in the book as well. And what sort of a role do you see organizations or institutions like the Film Institute playing in development of Sami film and media generally, and also the role of short films?
I can take that one. I think that one of the things that's exciting about short films is that they're a little bit less costly and overwhelming for a developing artist to produce. You can get the funds to do it. And for instance, Amanda Charnel's the first work that she did that became Sami Blood was a short that was premiered at the Sundance Festival. And so it allowed her to kind of have a first draft, in a sense, to have an iteration. And I think that one of the things that's super fascinating about contemporary media is that people have become a lot more comfortable with shorter length products, with films that are 8 minutes long, films that are 15 minutes long, little YouTube videos that are themselves highly crafted, beautifully executed works, and that is the new short story of our media world, and we consume those readily on the bus or as we're waiting somewhere in line for our whatever, and those are a new kind of creative genre that Sami people have again taken up and interrelated to this long-standing creative traditions, for instance, of Yoik, of making portraits of the world in very succinct, beautiful alterations.
Thank you. You start the book by referencing Monty Boynet's 1989 song Gula Gula, and you come back to her music again several times, including when you discuss the film Kautokeino Rebellion that she performed the soundtrack for. How is Monty Boynet's music important, and how does it fit into the context of Sami music in general over the past 30 years?
Yeah, please, Tom.
Well, there are a number of figures that come up again and again in the book. One of them is Monty Boynet, and another one is Niels Aslak Valkeapää, and they each in their own way have contributed so tremendously to the intellectual and activist traditions of the Sami community and broader Indigenous community actions. So Monty Boynet was somebody who came up with the idea in her first album to sing in Sami. And actually she tells stories about being booed from Norwegian audiences, people throwing things at her because she wasn't singing in the language of rock music, which was not Norwegian, but American English. She wasn't singing American English like Aha. She was singing in Sami. And she did that with very intense and carefully worded, politically motivated lyrics. And throughout her career, she has explored different kinds of genres and moved in her most recent album into English, and she's singing in English and has a new meaning because of all of her career of singing in Sami, and now she is sharing that in English. So it isn't like she's always been first and foremost a Sami artist and intellectual, and she's never hidden that. And she's always celebrated that. And I think that is something that's inspiring for other Sami artists. And people look up to her as somebody who has really done her part for the Sami movement.
Yeah, I think both Boynet and Niels Aslak Valkeapää that you also referred to have been described as past pioneers, like role models for many other generations of Sami artists. So they had a given place in our book.
Are there other trends in Sami music that you'd like that you wrote about that you'd like to mention or discuss besides these two famous performers?
Well, there are many trends. I don't know where to start, but it's clear that cultural workers have playing an important role and taking also responsibility in putting to the fore issues of like political issues and ideological stands in the current debate and situation in Nordic countries. So there've been a lot of discussion about exploitation of lands, for instance, which is a major problem that for many renti herders, but also other Sami. But that's relation to the land that we were talking about initially, and that's really at stake when the state or other companies from other countries are planning have a mind on the land. And we can see if you follow the lyrics and the place and the context in which the Sami artists are emerging, that you see they're really playing an important role there. Maybe not as politicians, but probably having a bigger impact that politicians would have in bringing forth these issues and engaging the public debate. That's one of the trends. But no, I wouldn't say that all Sami music is political. Of course, there's much more than that. But that's.
But I think that's so important because it's not only about reviving or revitalizing language and music traditions, but it's also about resisting extractivism and ongoing colonialism. That's so important.
Yeah, there's a great example of that in that Coppélie wrote about in one of her chapters on the Kulahalat Etnamin, or We Speak Earth. Maybe you can tell about that a little bit.
So it started the initiative like a yoke, make the yoke travel, a yoke that would represent the communication with the earth. And it's part of this sort of environmental movement, which is global, not only indigenous, but quite strong indigenous movement, which also interesting the way that the yoke is not in that context something specifically Sami, but something related to the land and how we cherish the land and how we share this concern with the land. So the Gulahalan Etnamin is one example.
Outstanding. Many people in the United States might be surprised to learn just how important new media have been in Sami political and cultural resurgence over the past 3 decades or so. What are some of the significant ways that Sami people have used new media, and why is it important for us to study them?
Okay, Tom, I go. Yes. The way in which that Sami artists and activists and cultural workers and other use media, both produced media and new media, so-called new media or digital media. It's a way to present a Sami agenda, and that can be traced back to the 70s and even earlier. And it was and still is part of a way to take control about our representations and images, like how Sami were represented from mainstream media, and to take control about this form of representations. And that's also what's taking place in social media, came in a bit later. For instance, on Instagram accounts that present voices of young Sami sharing their everyday life. And social media is also used for like a support group for language learners, or part of language revitalization processes, where people can just, encourage each other or share experiences. And I think that the presence and visibility of Sami languages in this new public domains, because that's what social media is, contribute also to changing attitudes, to giving more positive attitudes to languages. And that we know it's something important in revitalization processes.
You have a section in the book where you write about SamiNet and its historical role in Sami society, which can't be, I think, overstated. Would you like to talk to us a little bit more about SamiNet? Tell us what that was and why it's interesting.
Yeah, thank you for asking. SamiNet has also, like we discussed Monty Boynet, SamiNet has also a given place in the book. So it was a Sami network. Before we even talked about social media, it was in the Nordic countries. It started in 97, and it became with a small network, supporting mostly online learning. So it was the initiative of the National Union of Sami People in Sweden, as a low-tech solution on a first-class server and a web browser. So something that would be easy of access, even if you were not in an area where there was this good infrastructure for access. And it was rapidly adopted not only by the member of this organization or by the administrative rent-herding unit, which were the end users in mind from the designer, but it was also a lot of people joined, different individuals and institutions in Sápmi. So it became really a digital meeting place, quite a lot like the Jokkmokk market, the winter market, but operating in digitally. It had about 7,000 users at most, and it was shut down in 2011 because that by then also platforms like Facebook, for instance, had taken a bigger place on the internet, and was initiative like Saminet required more maintenance and more almost costly. But it's really interesting to see Saminet that was so early in that phase of developing digital media, which is so close to what we have on Facebook today, which means that it was really not a big step for people in Sápmi to use Facebook. They already knew what that kind of communication was. So that possibility to build groups, to circulate information, to add your contacts, there are a lot of similarities. But the main difference between the two platforms is also that there were different communities of users. So Saminet was really based on a specific community with a great degree of shared cultural knowledge and understanding, and the kind of idea that we know each other, we have something in common, and that's confidence and trust also that we can find in there. But on Facebook, we have this broad global community of users, and the only thing they have in common is maybe just a Facebook account. And still today, when talking about social media in Sápmi, almost everyone would refer to Saminet. That's kind of idea that we had something from the beginning, and it worked so well, and we felt safe. And Facebook is always compared to Saminet, and that's something that recurred quite early when I started interviews and conversation already 10 years ago.
Yeah, I would add to that one of the distinctive things about Saminet is that it's a lot like the way that Indigenous people in many parts of the world go about interacting. You find out when you meet somebody, well, who's your mother and who's your grandmother, and where do we fit in with each other, and where are you from, and those really important questions that again tie you back to land and to tradition and to family and to networks, and that would happen seamlessly on Saminet. In contrast, one of the things that we all know as a reality in products like Facebook is that you can be talking to somebody that you have no idea who they are, or whether they are really the person that they say they are, or all sorts of strange things where you'll get somebody trolling you, or it can create this feeling of being unsafe. And so I think that one of the things that Coppélie showed in her interviews is that for Sami people, the use of Facebook was still trying to get back to what they had in Saminet, and that is that you talk to people you already know, and maintain those relationships. You're not going out to find new people that that you can't be sure who they are, in fact, or what their motives are.
Yeah, we find it's groups. I mean, people use Facebook in many different ways, but you find also these groups on Facebook that kind of trying to create this safe space, as you described, Tom. Like, who can you trust? Who do you know who's there? And kind of replicate what there was on Saminet, and that's in smaller groups on Facebook, something you can try to do there. But I think also something with Saminet that I want to mention, that it was also really important for the languages, because that was also based on identifying need for people to use Sami language in digital communication. And at that time, like the late 90s, the possibilities to use Sami language and the orthography on computers was very limited. So that's also something in terms of language development that Saminet contributed with. One of the first digital places where people could use their languages when chatting and sending emails.
Thanks. That's really brings back a lot of memories too. We've been talking about a lot about understanding Sami media in Sami contexts, but but are there ways that looking at them in these things in more global contexts can help us to understand them better?
Yep.
And what might those ways be?
Who's first? Who's first?
I'll start, and then you pick up, Coppélie.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that we tried to show in the book right along is that Sami people have been demonstrate in their media products and in their internet activities a tremendous awareness of what's going on in other parts of the indigenous world, and a tremendous commitment to being part of an ongoing conversation about how we can move forward as a world community in ways that acknowledge and that empower indigenous rights. And I think that works that are so many of the works that we showcase or try to amplify the views of the Sami artists in our book are ones that are trying to speak out to a broader world community and tell them, like, here's the Sami, here's who we are, and here's how we interact with the things that are happening in your part of the world. And I think about two of the a number of the artists that were involved that we wrote about in the book, like Sophia Janok. She came to Standing Rock and was very active in helping underscore what was going on in that very important North American uprising of Native people and non-Indigenous allies for the environment, and did so from a Sami perspective and as a Sami person, and brought water to the encampment. So it's this wonderful way in which there's this dialogue that the internet helps create, in which organizations like the Canadian Idle No More can be in dialogue with the Sami Swatbanteror that does some unbelievably creative and feisty media works that are commenting on the political aspects of the situation in Sápmi. And this kind of back and forth depends on having some kind of shared set of media images and ideas. And we all know who James Bond is, or we all know who Rosie the Riveter is. And so if I, as a Swatbanteror artist, make an image that references that, I'm bringing in that dialogue. I'm creating that dialogue with a common set of knowledge while still being distinctively Sami. Coppélie.
Yeah, I think you covered most of it. No, I think it's like to study media, it's the way to understand our society, right? Because media is such an integrated part of our lives. So Sami media and media use tell us about what's important, what is the burning issues, and what discourses are questioned or not, and that kind of thing. So I think it's a way to understand not only what's happening in Sápmi, because we need to remember that Sápmi is not this isolated place. It's part of a national context and discourses and global networks and movements. So like the examples you gave, Tom, with Idle No More, or with the Dakota Access Pipeline. There are many other examples about how this international global issues have such a large context, and that's why we can see Sápmi as part of that, and how Sami, what's happening in a small place such as Gallok that maybe people ignored from an international perspective, was really a milestone for the development of bringing for that kind of issues.
Thank you. We're getting really close to the time when we want to open it up to questions from the audience, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to bring up any other issues or topics that you might have wanted to talk about, and I didn't give you a chance with my questions.
Well, I hope when people look at the book, they'll understand that we couldn't cover everyone. There is such a tremendous wealth of choices and fantastic artists and activists and artivists doing unbelievable work. And it's always changing. One of the things that I hope people will notice, or at least I want to acknowledge that we worked really hard on it, is that we tried to have a very deliberate gender balance in the people that we wrote about, that we would write about more or less equal number of each gender, or there's other orientations involved too. So that was a very intentional part of thinking about what works we would feature, all of which are fantastic works, but there are other people too that ended up not being included. And it doesn't mean that these are somehow the superstars. It is that we're trying to give a snapshot of a living and very dynamic cultural and political situation that's unfolding in 4 different countries, as well as in the world more broadly.
Yeah, it was quite a challenge to limit who and where and what to cover in this book. So maybe there would be other books following to add to what we couldn't cover in that book. Now I also wanted to mention, we had this small talk before we started the seminar. I also commented that it would be quite different if we were writing this book today. In the middle of the pandemics, and where the digital media use is so different. Like, for instance, how the Jokkmokk Winter Market is taking place now digitally. And I was taking part today a small event celebrating the Sami National Day in Umeå. That was streamed on Facebook and YouTube for obvious reasons. And one aspect that was mentioned there was just the importance of gathering and meeting at Sápmi. The organizer defined it as it's part of Sami culture. And I think it's interesting and it's important to see celebration of the National Day of Winter Market taking place despite the circumstances online. And of course, it cannot replace traditional forms of gathering. And I think that most people are looking forward to meeting in person in Jokkmokk next year. But I think there is much more to investigate there also about how our use of media can help us to in this continuity of traditions and meeting and such.
Thank you so much. We're going to move now to take questions from the attendees, and we have a number of them here. And I'll just read the first one from Peter. It says, 10 to 15 years ago, I watched an IMAX movie that described the communication between the Sami and Canadian Indigenous groups. Are you familiar with the film? Do you remember what it was called? And can you elaborate on the link between Sami and North American Indigenous groups? I think you've started to answer that last part already, but you might have more to say on that.
Yeah, the link between Sami and North American Indigenous groups, I was in terms of networks. That's something that has been going on for a long time, but we see also it's rapidly strengthening and emerging thanks to our way to travel and to communicate digital media. And it's not only about hashtags and political statements, but also, for instance, how Sami people could on site show support also for the protest for the Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance, and how North American activists came to Sápmi and could have workshops and discussions together with Sami activists here. So there is that kind of links and collaborations. And I don't know about that movie. Do you know, Tom?
I think I'm not sure of the exact details of it, but I would say that in our book, we do talk about the really central role that Canadian Indigenous First Nation communities have had in the wider Fourth World or Indigenous movement, and the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, which Nestigan was very involved in, was something that got its start had its first meetings in Canada, and that for people like Nestigan visiting the Canadian First Nation communities, as well as North American Indigenous communities, American Indigenous communities was a very, very important experience. It gave a perspective on the colonial experience and kind of opened Sami activists' eyes to what had been happening in Sápmi, but that they hadn't really understood in quite the same way. And to see that those parallels over and over again in different parts of the world was really profound. And I think that there's been a back and forth ever since the early 70s in that way.
We've got another question from an anonymous attendee. How do Sami words compare to Inuit in terms of words for snow? More or less words, or more or less descriptive, etc.? Are there other languages that are similar for their words for snow?
I don't know.
You know, the Sami people are very, very proud of how many words there are in different Sami languages for different kinds of snow and different uses. And one of the things that I'm always trying to underscore with students when I teach a course in Sami culture is that those all have practical purposes. It's not like people came up with, let's just come up with a whole bunch of abstract ideas for a whole lot of snows. There are very pragmatic reasons why one wants to know whether the surface of the snow will support a reindeer or not, because it changes completely the experience of herding if your herd can go running off on top of the snow versus if they have to trudge through it. So there are varieties of words for tracks, for how many tracks there are in the snow, for the conditions of the snow, how good it is for skiing, and those are very pragmatic and very practical parts, especially of the livelihoods of Sami who are involved to one extent or another in traditional activities like reindeer herding or hunting and fishing. And one of the important questions is how to bring that heritage forward for an urban Sami child growing up, let's say in Stockholm, where there might not be that much need for those particular words for snow, and yet it is part of the Sami heritage. And so that's a really important question to kind of grapple with. What makes Sami education? How do we share that with the next generation, and how do we build on the creativity and the wisdom and the traditional knowledge that has come down to us from the past?
Yeah, I don't know at all about the Inuit terms for snow. I can't compare or give any answer to that. But yeah, exactly as you say, Tom, it's the word for snow are related to the need to describe something, and that's why that's also the reason why the Sami languages are still, also the arts written, stronger in the domain of reindeer herding, because that's when you need also the specific terms to describe, for instance, if the reindeer can access the food despite the kind of snow or what kind of snow it is, and what need of the reindeer herder you need to describe for providing food for reindeer and for skiing and traveling. So that's illustrate this domain of languages that are quite strong, because there is a need for words. But yeah, about the question about Inuit terms for snow, I don't know.
Yeah, the Sami linguist Nils Janslatten published a chapter back in the late 90s about Sami terms for snow and ice, and he had well over 200 terms that he was discussing there.
Yeah.
And I don't know any of the Inuit languages either, but he claimed that Sami language has the most terms for snow and ice in the world. I don't know on what basis, but that's as far as I can go towards that. Dennis Saxman asks a very important question for those members of our audience who don't know. What is a yoik?
Yeah, right. I mentioned rapidly a yoik, but I didn't say what it is. Yoik is a traditional way of singing and storytelling in Sami. And it differs quite a lot from different Sami areas. So if it's South Sami or North Sami or Eastern Sami, so there are many different kind of yoiks. It's both singing and storytelling. we should listen to some music, I feel. We're referring to all these great artists. Maybe
I hope that Troy has been really wonderful about putting some of the names of some of the artists we've been talking about in the chat, and a lot of these artists have their products on YouTube. You can listen to, I think, the works of some of the people that Troy has mentioned there, or that we've talked about, and get a feel for. There's both a very traditional way of yoiking, and then Sami artists have brought yoik into dialogue with other musical traditions and with other kind of instrumentation. So there's jazz yoik, and there's a rock influenced yoik, and there's a kind of a hip hop yoik, and it's really a fantastically creative and dynamic framework that is going on in these creative works.
All right. Richard Jones Bamman asks us, hello. Could you comment on the role early Sami recording companies, Dat, Idun, Yargaliadji, played in helping bring Sami artists like Ailohash and Monty Boynet to both Sami and other audiences?
I would refer to the works of Richard Jones Bamman. He's a fantastic scholar on exactly that topic, and also a PhD from the University of Washington. I think that what Richard shows in his own research on those topics is really important, that there was this way in which Sami took control of the production of their products. They created their own companies, and this is also something that Niels Aslak Valkeapää did with publishing. He started his own publishing house because he didn't want to just be told by the press, here's how your book is going to look. He wanted to have a say in every aspect of that. And that idea of self-determination is something that was happening there, and that allowed for really important acts like the tours that Niels Aslak did to North America, where a lot of people, particularly Sami Americans, will talk about those tours as one of the first opportunities they had to hear Sami yoik and being performed, and to get back in touch with that tradition that maybe their grandparents had known, but that hadn't survived or continued in North America in the immigrant context. So there was a tremendous amount of those were absolutely important moments in building and media movement for Sami.
There's been a couple questions both in the Q&A section and people asking questions in chat as well about the impact of COVID-19 on Sami populations. The questions are comparing it with the way that COVID has disproportionately impacted Indigenous communities in North America, and wondering if that's the same in Sápmi, and also what impact that might be having, for example, on Sami language.
Good question. It's quite early, I think, to know the impact. We also need to remember that Sami work in many different kind of professions and live in many different kind of settings. So in that we're affecting in many different ways. But if we think in like renti herding settings, of course, it's difficult to work remotely or to adapt your way of life to on a more digital setting. So for these groups, life has to go on, and as usual, and with all the risks it implies. But then we also have this what might be difficult for us to answer in this context is that in Nordic context you cannot have any records based on ethnicity. So we won't have any record from public health about who's affected by COVID or not based on ethnicity. So it's quite difficult to know how the Sami are represented in this, because we don't have, it's a legal aspect. That means that there is no census, or we can't ask about ethnicity in collecting data. I think it's a big difference in the North American context, right?
I would say also that, you know, there's that epidemiological situation. There's also a cultural perception of COVID, and I think one of the painful things for Sami people is when those events like the Jokkmokk Winter Market or Skatmakovat, the film festival in Inari, can't happen person to person, because Sami people social distance. Wow, Sami people have had that for eons, because you're traveling, you're out, and there's plenty of space between people and lots of silence. But then there's those moments where people get together and share singing and share coffee, and those became impossible in this year. And that's a really wounding experience for people. And I think that that's paralleled in many, many other contexts around the world, but that we need to allow ourselves to grieve for those moments where those things that we really cherish didn't happen. And yes, the digital Jokkmokk is a great lemonade from the lemons, but it is still a very painful thing that the ability to be connected in that very special way couldn't happen anymore.
Maybe just a follow-up for that. There have been a couple questions about Jokkmokk market online, and about, for example, are there ways that people are trying to bring food, which is such an important part of the market, bring some of the images of food or describe taste or smell of food into that? And then a question about what other major Sami events that normally take place face-to-face might be happening digitally in the near future.
Well, there's annual Sami festival in Umeå in Umeå that usually takes place in March, and now it's been postponed to fall. So, and hopefully it can take place on a physical place and not only digitally, but fingers crossed. I don't know about other events. There are sports events also in Sápmi that are quite important for young Sami, or a gathering for sports, but sport is also the occasion for other kind of gatherings, which I guess is quite difficult to have to take place online. So I think it's good, Tom, that you brought this topic, that the cultural aspect, not only the medical epidemiological aspect, consequences of COVID, that this form of gatherings, of course, will affect the way people interact and continue to establish relations.
Dennis Saxman asks an important question. Are there any Sami media explorations of LGBTQ expressions?
I'll start, and then Coppélie, you can follow up. There's a really important project that was mostly based in Sweden, if I'm...
The Queering Sápmi project?
Queering Sápmi. And the notion of it was simply to make visible the testimonies and the viewpoints of queer Sami people, and did so in a very poignant way. And then there was an online site where people could share their viewpoints, and then there were meetups, and so those were arranged in different spots. And the project ended after a set number of years, but it really did establish an important acknowledgement of the fact that there are lots of LGBTQ Sami people, and that you can be queer and Sami, and those are not mutually exclusive categories in any sense.
Yeah, I think if you search for queering Sápmi projects, you'll find it resulted in an exhibition and a book. I'm not sure if the book's been translated to English. It might be only in Swedish. Okay, and Tom confirms it's only in Swedish. Okay, yeah.
I think I might have seen it in Norwegian, but maybe I'm just imagining that.
Maybe I know there was some idea to have it translated in different languages, but I'm not sure what.
There's also a film, My Little Sister from the Finnish side, the documentary film where the filmmaker explores her lesbian sister's journey to find acceptance in her own Sami family. It's an important one. We're getting very close to the time when we should probably end. There's so many good questions here. It's hard to find one, but I think an important one, or to combine several of them. Some people have been asking who's the intended audience of this book? Is it more academic or more for a general public? And people have asked where can they buy the book?
So the intended audience, we're hoping that as many as possible can want to read it. So we didn't limit to an academic audience. We think that it would make sense for academics in the field of media studies and Sami studies or Indigenous studies. But our goal with the book was also to make it accessible for general public, a broad audience, and also for students, but not only in academic context. And yeah, and Stina already answered the question where you can find it. There's a Nordic Museum online, or you can check the Washington Press. So.
Yeah, I want to just say that I'm planning on using this as a textbook for an undergraduate, a lower division undergraduate class. So students who haven't really gotten fully immersed in using academic reading yet. And I think it will be very useful for them. It's also useful for graduate students and professors, but it's open to, you've written it in a way that makes it very accessible to people, both inside of academia and outside of academia. I want to thank both of you very much, give you virtual applause. And I want to thank our audience and all the great questions that we have, and apologize to those whose questions we weren't able to get to. But I'll turn it back over to Stina now.
So I think I speak for everyone here in the audience when I extend a very, very heartfelt thank you to all of you, to Tom, Coppélie, and Troy. This was most wonderful and intriguing, enlightening conversation, and we're so grateful that we could do this on Sami Day. And I put it in the chat, but I also want to say again that the book, of course, you need to buy it, you need to read it, and it's available at the museum store online. So with that, I want to thank you once again, and thank you everybody who joined us. And we look forward to other programs, and we look forward to your next book on this topic. So thank you, and happy Sami Day, everybody.
Thank you so much.